It was 4:12 a.m., the kind of silence that only exists seconds before something irreversible happens, when strategy is already locked in and regret hasn't arrived yet. Out over the Black Sea, engines hummed at cruising altitude, unseen, unchallenged, obedient to code written hours earlier. This was supposed to be a message, a sharp, punishing reply. Moscow wanted the world to see resolve, dominance, precision. What it delivered instead was a shockwave that bent back toward itself. Russia's December 12th strike was framed as retaliation, a controlled show of force against Ukraine's last remaining maritime lifelines. Missiles and drones moved with algorithmic calm, threading the dark toward ports that feed economies, not armies. But as the smoke climbed and flames reflected off black water, the picture cracked. The ships burning in harbor weren't Ukrainian military assets. They weren't carrying armor or ammunition. They were Turkish-owned civilian vessels, silent, vulnerable, and unmistakably off-limits. This wasn't random, not artillery drift, not battlefield fog. The drones used were precision-guided, GPS and INS-locked, programmed with coordinates long before launch. Targets chosen, paths calculated, impact guaranteed. These machines don't improvise. They obey intent. And intent, in this case, was devastatingly clear. While the drones crossed the sea, another scene was unfolding hundreds of miles away. Under warm lights and cameras, Vladimir Putin was shaking hands with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Smiles, diplomatic language, carefully chosen words about cooperation, stability, and the safety of civilian shipping. Two timelines running in parallel. One selling reassurance, the other delivering fire. That timing wasn't coincidence. In geopolitics, coincidence is the rarest resource. Every hour is weighed. Every minute costs something. Launching a strike while your supposed partner is standing beside you isn't strength. It's rupture. Trust doesn't crack loudly. It fractures quietly, then collapses all at once. When the first Turkish ship burned, Ankara took notice. When the second was struck, patterns emerged. When a third incident followed, any remaining ambiguity evaporated. Statistics don't lie. Randomness doesn't select the same flag repeatedly. This wasn't collateral damage. It was a deliberate crossing of an invisible line that everyone in maritime warfare understands but few ever dare to touch. The escalation didn't roar. It whispered. Insurance desks in London recalculated risk models. Underwriters in Istanbul paused policies mid-sentence. Premiums surged. 5%, 8%, 10% of hull value, numbers that don't just hurt profits, they kill routes. In shipping, confidence is oxygen. Remove it, and even the largest fleet suffocates. Here's the reversal Moscow failed to anticipate. The Black Sea isn't just a battlefield. It's Russia's economic artery. With European markets closed and northern routes frozen, oil and grain flow south and west through a single narrow system, ports, sea lanes, and straits controlled not by Russia, but by Turkey. Strategy isn't about how hard you strike. It's about what you endanger when you do. By igniting civilian ships, Russia didn't isolate Ukraine. It contaminated the entire basin. Shipowners don't distinguish between enemy port and friendly port when fire is indiscriminate. If Odessa burns, Novorossiysk feels the heat. If one insurer pulls out, the rest follow. Maritime ecosystems don't fragment, they cascade. This is where force met foresight and lost. Turkey didn't threaten. It didn't posture. It didn't move a single warship. It simply reminded the world, in calm diplomatic language, that safety matters, that infrastructure matters, that patience has limits. In strategy, silence backed by leverage is louder than missiles. Because Turkey doesn't need to close the straits to choke pressure. It can slow them, inspect more carefully, demand higher guarantees, apply regulations written for moments exactly like this. Bureaucracy becomes ballast. Delays become weapons. And the shadow fleet, aging tankers with fragile paperwork and thinner insurance, feels every second stretch into cost. This is the lesson modern warfare keeps relearning the hard way. Firepower can destroy targets, cannot control consequences. Precision without perspective is just speed toward self-harm. Strategy is subtraction, removing your opponent's options without erasing your own. Russia wanted a dramatic reply. It got an international controversy. It wanted to project dominance. It exposed vulnerability. It wanted to send a warning. It rewrote the risk equation against itself. And here's the part most people missed. The ship that burned was extinguished. The fire that mattered wasn't. It spread into contracts, premiums, transit logs, and quiet policy rooms where decisions are made without cameras or speeches. That fire is still moving, because when trust leaves the sea, it doesn't come back with apologies. It returns only after power shifts. And the next move won't come from a missile launch. It will come from a signature, a delay, a rule suddenly enforced. So the question now isn't what Russia will strike next. It's how long its own ships can afford to wait. It was happening at the same minute. Handshakes above the table, explosions below the horizon, diplomacy speaking one language while drones spoke another. In a conference hall washed in soft light, Vladimir Putin leaned forward, measured, controlled, projecting calm. Across from him, Recep Tayyip Erdogan listened with the patience of a man who understands leverage better than volume. Cameras clicked. Translators murmured. Words like cooperation, stability, and balance floated into the air. And far away over the Black Sea, code-guided drones were already descending. This was the moment diplomacy cracked in real time. Not afterward. Not in press releases. But live, simultaneous, undeniable. The strike wasn't just an attack on steel and cargo. It was an interruption of trust mid-sentence. While leaders spoke about protecting civilian shipping, Turkish-owned vessels were burning in Ukrainian ports. That contrast hit harder than any missile. Because in geopolitics, timing is intent. And intent is everything. At first, Moscow's narrative moved fast. Retaliation, military necessity, a warning shot, but Ankara didn't rush to respond. Paused. And in that pause, something shifted. Turkey doesn't interpret the world emotionally. It reads patterns. It counts repetitions. One ship can be an error. Two can be chance. Three becomes a message. This wasn't coincidence. It was alignment. Algorithms don't drift. GPS doesn't improvise. Precision weapons don't misunderstand flags. The core mechanism was obvious to anyone who understands modern warfare. Targets were selected in advance, trajectories calculated hours earlier, decisions locked long before smiles were exchanged in that meeting room. That realization changed everything. Because neutrality is a fragile thing. It survives on predictability. The moment civilian vessels of a neutral power are struck, repeatedly, neutrality stops being a buffer and starts becoming a liability. Ankara saw the line being tested, not crossed loudly, but nudged with calculated ambiguity. And ambiguity, when backed by fire, is pressure. The escalation didn't come with threats. Came with silence. Quiet phone calls. Carefully worded statements. Diplomatic language so restrained it almost sounded polite. But beneath that calm was a warning sharper than any ultimatum. Civilian shipping is not negotiable. This is where the paradox deepened. Russia sought dominance through disruption, but disruption doesn't scare states like Turkey. It activates systems, legal frameworks, insurance protocols, maritime conventions written for moments when power forgets restraint. Strategy isn't only about what you destroy. It's about which rules you force others to reread. In Ankara, the concern wasn't just the ships already hit. It was precedent. If Turkish vessels could be struck while leadership was in dialogue, what did cooperation even mean? What was the value of assurances if they evaporated under the first algorithmic command? That's when the rupture widened. Not publicly, but structurally. Civilian maritime safety became the central question. Not Ukraine. Not retaliation. Safety. Because once safety collapses, alliances don't have to shift dramatically. They simply stop functioning. And that's the quiet power of Turkey's position. It sits at the junction of law and geography. It doesn't need to raise its voice. It only needs to let procedures speak. Inspections, guarantees, documentation. Every rule suddenly matters. Every delay suddenly costs money. And money, unlike rhetoric, doesn't ignore reality. This wasn't escalation through force. It was escalation through attention, through the slow, deliberate reevaluation of what risk really means. Insurance markets felt it first, then shipowners, then logistics firms who realized that neutrality no longer protected them from becoming symbols. The philosophical layer here is uncomfortable but unavoidable. In modern conflict, strategy beats spectacle. Mind beats mass. Foresight outpaces firepower. You can win a strike and lose the board. You can dominate a moment and surrender the long game. Russia wanted to demonstrate control. Instead, it demonstrated unpredictability. And unpredictability doesn't intimidate professionals. It alienates them. The turning point wasn't the explosion. It was the realization, in quiet rooms and secure calls, that diplomacy had been undermined not by disagreement, but by contradiction. Saying one thing while doing another isn't strength. It's leakage. And once credibility leaks, it never drains cleanly. Turkey didn't break ties. It didn't shout betrayal. It did something far more dangerous to any power dependent on stability. It started recalculating. Because when a neutral power begins to question where it stands, the entire balance shifts. Lines blur, assumptions collapse, and suddenly, every ship waiting at sea feels heavier than it did yesterday. This wasn't about anger. It was about boundaries, about how far ambiguity could be stretched before it snapped. And now, the real question isn't whether diplomacy survived that meeting. It's what quiet decision was made after the cameras turned off. 18:03 a.m. The missiles were already cold, but the real damage was just warming up, inside offices with no windows where numbers decide whether ships move or stay frozen in place. The first reaction didn't come from generals or presidents. It came from underwriters. Screens flickered in London. Phones rang in Istanbul. A single question cut through the noise. Is the Black Sea still insurable? Hours earlier, fire had climbed the hull of a civilian ship. Not a warship. Not an escort. Just steel, cargo, and a flag that was never meant to be part of the fight. That image traveled faster than any official statement. Faster than denials. Faster than explanations. Because markets don't listen to speeches. They react to risk. War risk premiums jumped almost instantly. 1% became 5. 5 flirted with 10. On a vessel worth $50 million, that's not a surcharge. It's a verdict. A single voyage suddenly cost more than a year of profit. Shipowners didn't need to be told what to do next. They already knew. This is how modern economic warfare actually works. Not with blockades, but with hesitation. Not with explosions, but with spreadsheets. When confidence collapses, trade doesn't slow, it evaporates. The escalation moved in layers. First, insurers rewrote policies. Then, reinsurers quietly stepped back. Then charterers began inserting new clauses, escape hatches disguised as legal language. By the end of the day, captains were receiving messages that didn't say "do not sail," but felt exactly like it. Here's the mechanism most people miss. Maritime trade is an ecosystem, not a pipeline. You don't choke one port without starving another. Routes share crews, insurers, financiers, schedules. When one node burns, the entire network recalculates. Ukraine felt it immediately. Aid shipments hesitated. Energy equipment stalled offshore. Every delay added pressure to a grid already stretched thin. But the real reversal came on the other side of the sea. Russia depends on this basin more than it admits. Oil, grain, petroleum products. With northern routes constrained and western markets closed, the Black Sea isn't optional. It's essential. Every tanker leaving Russian ports relies on the same underwriters, the same insurers, the same confidence that just took a direct hit. This is where the domino effect reveals its teeth. If a shipowner refuses Odessa today, they hesitate at Novorossiysk tomorrow. Not out of politics, but survival. Insurance doesn't distinguish between flags once a zone is labeled unstable. Risk pools merge. Premiums spread. One explosion rewrites the entire algorithm. And suddenly, the numbers stop making sense. A $10 million cargo isn't worth sailing if a single drone can turn it into scrap and debt. A port isn't profitable if ships arrive uninsured. Dominance loses meaning when no one wants to participate. This is the turning point where force collides with finance, and finance always has the longer memory. Russia's strike aimed to constrict Ukraine's arteries. Instead, it spiked its own blood pressure. Export costs climbed. Margins thinned. Waiting times stretched. Each delay bled money in silence. No headlines. No footage. Just loss. The Shadow Fleet felt it hardest. Old hulls. Complicated ownership. Minimal paperwork. These ships survive in gray zones, tolerated as long as the sea feels predictable. But unpredictability is poison to shadows. When scrutiny increases, shadows vanish or sink. This wasn't a shockwave you could intercept. It was a paradigm shift you couldn't missile away. And here's the philosophical cut beneath the surface. Strategy isn't about striking hardest. It's about understanding second-order effects. Firepower can destroy assets, cannot force trust to stay alive. Mind beats mass. Foresight beats firepower every time. By turning the Black Sea into a question mark, Russia didn't isolate its enemy. It isolated itself from certainty, from routine, from the invisible systems that turn resources into revenue. Shipowners began running simulations. 10 seconds of math replaced 10 minutes of debate. What would you do if one launch could erase your entire balance sheet? Most chose caution. Caution looks boring on camera, but it wins wars of endurance. This is why economic pressure rarely announces itself. It just accumulates. One missed shipment, one delayed payment, one port less attractive than yesterday, then another, then another. The sea didn't close. It hesitated. And that hesitation cost more than any blockade ever could. The lesson is uncomfortable but precise. When you weaponize uncertainty, you don't control where it lands. You only control when it starts. After that, markets take over. And markets don't negotiate. The Black Sea became a mirror. Every actor saw their own vulnerability reflected back at them. Ukraine saw its lifelines thinning. Russia saw its exports trembling. Everyone else saw a zone where logic no longer guaranteed safety. And now, as tankers wait longer at anchorage and contracts pile up unsigned, a deeper question hangs in the air. If trade can be stopped without closing a single strait, what happens when someone decides to tighten one? At 6:41 a.m., nothing moved. No missiles, no warnings, just tankers idling at anchor, engines humming, crews staring at a shoreline that suddenly held more power than any navy. This is where the story flips. Not with explosions, but with paperwork. Not with fleets, but with forms. Because after the smoke cleared, Turkey didn't reach for weapons. It reached for rules. The world likes loud leverage. Aircraft carriers, missile ranges, shock and awe dominance. But Turkey's advantage has always been quieter, older, sharper. Geography fused with law. A narrow passage where global trade compresses into single-file patience. Where every ship must ask permission without ever calling it that. The Black Sea empties through Turkey's hands. Every barrel, every grain shipment, every shadow tanker pretending not to belong to anyone. And after the attack on Turkish-owned ships, that reality stopped being theoretical. No announcements were needed. No threats issued. The escalation came wrapped in calm language about safety, liability, and environmental risk. Words that sound harmless. Words that terrify logistics managers. Inspections grew longer, not aggressive, thorough. Documents were reviewed twice, then again. Insurance certificates were scrutinized down to commas. Coverage limits that once passed now raised eyebrows. For safety reasons, officials said. Always safety. Here's the mechanism that turns silence into force. Shadow fleets operate on speed and ambiguity. Old ships, complex ownership, insurance that barely clears the minimum. They survive because no one wants to slow the system down. But the moment scrutiny becomes normal, the system jams. 1 extra hour becomes 6. 6 becomes 24. A day at anchor costs tens of thousands of dollars. A week burns millions. Multiply that across dozens of ships and suddenly the math doesn't work. This is pressure without fingerprints. Russia doesn't need Turkey to close the straits to feel the squeeze. It only needs Turkey to care more, to ask more questions, to demand higher standards, to enforce rules that already exist but were once flexible. That's the turning point most strategists miss. Power isn't always about changing the law. Sometimes it's about remembering it. Every tanker bound for Asian markets now carries an invisible timer. Every delay compounds risk. Crews grow restless. Contracts fray. Buyers hesitate. And the oil still flows, but slower, costlier, heavier with uncertainty. Compare the numbers. A missile costs hundreds of thousands. A delayed supertanker can cost millions per day. Which one bleeds an economy faster? This is where strategy outpaces firepower. Mind over mass. Foresight over force. Turkey didn't escalate the conflict. It redefined the battlefield. From open water to administrative depth. From visible violence to invisible friction. A paradigm shift that doesn't trend on social media but reshapes outcomes. And the irony cuts deep. Russia sought to isolate Ukraine by sea. Instead, it exposed its own dependence on that same sea. Dependence on routes it doesn't control. On gates it doesn't guard. On a country that doesn't need to choose sides loudly to choose outcomes effectively. Neutrality, when combined with geography, becomes leverage. Every additional requirement placed on transit sends a signal. Not just to Moscow, but to insurers, traders, and shipowners worldwide. The Black Sea is no longer routine. It's conditional. And conditional trade is fragile trade. This isn't about punishment. It's about recalibration. Turkey doesn't need to prove strength. It only needs to protect itself. And in doing so, it holds the switch to someone else's engine. The philosophical lesson lands hard. In modern conflict, the most decisive moves often look boring. A stamp, a checklist, a delay justified by safety. Strategy isn't spectacle, it's positioning. The fire that burned one ship didn't spread across the water. It spread across balance sheets. And now, as tankers queue longer, as premiums climb, as shadow fleets fade into daylight they were never built to survive, the equation has changed. Russia wanted to apply pressure outward. It discovered pressure flows both ways. Because when your economy breathes through a narrow passage, and someone else controls the airflow, dominance becomes irrelevant. Patience becomes power. And the final question lingers, unanswered and unsettling.